Hey, Karim Sirajuddin here, founder of Nude Human Consulting. The Coffee with Karim podcast aims to provide Muslims and people of all backgrounds a space to share their life gifts, meet dynamic guests, and enhance the human experience one cup of coffee at a time. Sit back and sip. Episode 16, Sexuality and Erotology in Islam. Welcome to another episode of Coffee with Karim. Today I have an esteemed guest, Habeeb Akande. He is a British-born writer and historian of Nigerian descent. He is the author of 5 published books on race, erotic Muslim literature, and Afro-Brazilian history. He is currently working on producing a documentary about being black and Muslim in Brazil. He graduated from Kingston University, as well as studied Islamic law and Islamic history at Al-Azhar High School and University. Brother Habeeb, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Jazakallah khairan for inviting me, brother. How are you?
Alhamdulillah. How are you? Is it too late over there in the UK? I'm assuming you're not having coffee with me right now?
No, it's more like dinner time in London now.
I see. Are you a coffee drinker?
I'm more of a tea drinker and hot chocolate drinker, to be honest with you.
Oh, mashallah. Sounds good. Yeah, I should add that to the list, hot chocolate. First of all, hats off to you. The book you wrote, A Taste of Honey, Sexuality and Erotology in Islam. I was so happy to find this book, and I first learned about it through Facebook. As you may or may not know, I do a lot of couples work with Muslims exclusively, and sexuality is always a very important primal need amongst men and women. And I love how you put this wonderful, almost like the first manual, at least in the English language that I'm aware of really understanding sexuality in the Islamic tradition. And you also use a lot of sources from contemporary science and psychology. And I thought it was very well put together. But I'm very curious, what made you write a book called A Taste of Honey, Sexuality and Erotology in Islam?
Well, whilst I was in Egypt, when I was in Azhar studying, I came across a number of books written by well-renowned Muslim scholars like Imam al-Suyuti, who wrote a number of books talking about sexuality within Islamic framework. And I was quite shocked by this because I thought this was the type of books we needed in the English language. And there was a famous hadith related in both Bukhari and Muslim, in which the Prophet ﷺ used an expression, "Dhuqul usayla," mean taste the honey, in which a woman went to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and complained that her husband wasn't able to satisfy her and she wanted a divorce. And the Prophet ﷺ used the phrase, "Did you taste his honey and did he taste your honey?" Did you consummate the marriage? And it's a very beautiful phrase and Arabic expression which the Prophet ﷺ used. And that hadith itself was used as the foundation for a number of Muslim scholars who spoke about the importance of sexual pleasure both for the man and the woman. And so I wanted to pay homage to that particular hadith and use it as the foundation to hopefully try and revive the tradition of talking about sexuality and sex-positive discussions within the Islamic framework, because I think it's very important.
Right. No, I love that. I'm so glad you're trying to revive this balance and, of course, show that it is an essential component of Islamic literature and history, isn't it?
Most definitely, most definitely. Imam al-Suyuti, he wrote over 24 books about sexual relations and sexual conduct, and this is we know him as being a great theologian and as a jurist, a faqih, but we don't know that he also spoke about sexual relations and not just talking about the halal and the haram, because unfortunately many of the books that we see, many of the, you could say, the religious books that talk about sex just talk about what is permitted and what is forbidden, the halal and haram, whereas a lot of the early Muslim scholars, their approach to talking about this topic was approaching it as not really talking about what is permitted and what's not permitted, but they acted as, you could say, social commentators of their time. They were talking about the various sexual practices that people undertook, those that which were within the confines of Islam and those that weren't within the confines of Islam. And I think that type of approach is something which unfortunately a lot of our religiously inclined Muslims have kind of lost. So they just want to stick to very dogmatic approaches of talking about sex, when in reality the early Muslim scholars, they were more, you can say, contemporary sociologists, so to speak, which I think is important that we try to revive.
Absolutely. I mean, I've just been shocked by the fact that some Muslims, mashallah, I mean, we're, majority of Muslims, at least in the United States, there's a very strong emphasis on education and economic success. And, you have brilliant lawyers and doctors and engineers. But then how many people do I know who got married? Their parents never once talked to them about sexuality. and the wedding night and what it means to be in an intimate relationship with one spouse, right? It's like we have this very twisted, impractical, immature way of dealing with sexuality. It's like, we're not going to talk about it. You're not allowed to talk to girls. You're not allowed to talk to men. There's no sex before marriage. And you just shut up and practice your religion and get your degrees. And then, Bismillah, Allahu Akbar, we get you married and go figure it out. And then we wonder why there's so much trauma and distortion in these aspects of marital life. I mean, is this something similar that is happening in the UK from your observation, or are you unable to comment about that?
No, it's very much happening in the UK. But one thing I've noticed, like, majority of the Muslims in the UK are of South Asian descent, and obviously I grew up in a predominantly Nigerian mosque. But our attitude in terms of approaching sensuality and sex was a bit more open and liberal. It's a Muslim problem, but again, it depends on, I would say, like the Muslims' background, their cultural background. Because I've noticed amongst a lot of, unfortunately, South Asian and you can say some Arab Muslims, where they don't really have these type of conversations with their parents or even amongst their friends. Whereas the community I grew up in, which are predominantly people of African descent, it was quite common to have these kind of conversations. When did the Muslims become very prudish? We had a rich history, literature tradition talking about these types of issues to do with sex and sexuality and sensuality. When the British colonized much of the Muslim world in the 19th century, they brought with them their understanding of morality. And the British, during the Victorian times, were known to be very prude, extremely prude. And you can say that was something that unfortunately many of the Muslims took upon themselves when they approached the topic of sex and sexuality. Again, that led me to realize, okay, this phenomenon is a recent phenomenon, because again, prior to like the British colonizing the Muslim world, a lot of the Muslims had quite a liberal attitude in terms of talking about sex and sexuality, whether you're looking at the Middle East, whether you're looking at the Indian subcontinent, or whether you're looking at much of North Africa.
So your book is called A Taste of Honey, Sexuality and Erotology in Islam. What's the difference between sexuality and erotology? Can you define those for us and help us understand the differences and commonality?
Sexuality refers to the human capacity for sexual feelings and also refers to one's sexual orientation. But for the purpose of my book, I was mainly I used sexuality in the subtitle, referring to the human capacity for sexual feelings, however it manifests in different ways. Okay, so it's not just sexual orientation, because unfortunately nowadays when people think of sexuality, they generally think of just either heterosexuality or homosexuality, as opposed to the other definition meaning like the capacity for sexual feelings. With regards to erotology, the definition of erotology is a study of sexual desire and sexual behavior. Erotology comprises of two words, just speaking about the etymology of the word, from eros, which is a Greek word meaning desire, and ology meaning the study of. So the study of sexual desire, that's what erotology basically means. There's a Islamic science called ilm al-bah, like the knowledge of sex, and that is translated as like erotology, or sometimes it's considered to be like sexology. I also want to add, although obviously I've subtitled my book Erotology in Islam, there's a difference between erotology and the modern. Sexology is considered to be an objective study of sexual conduct, whereas erotology is considered to be subjective. Sexology just looks at human practices without understanding the wisdoms, or even you can say the philosophy of why people behave in a certain way. Whereas with erotology, it's looking at sexual practices, but also, like you could say, it's giving an opinion.
Got it. Thank you so much for clarifying. So according to erotology, this is the idea of studying what is desirable, correct? What makes us feel that alluring attraction, that magnetic force. So sexuality from an Islamic perspective is going to also be anchored in fiqh, or Islamic law, and the application of it. So that means that whether you're Nigerian, Chinese, Egyptian, or American Muslim, sexuality according to Islam is going to define for you what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do, right? So, for example, anal sex is going to be haram for everybody. It doesn't matter what culture you're from. That's according to sexuality in Islam. But then erotology would be something like, okay, but when it comes to this culture, maybe, for instance, part of the eroticism is, feet or hair or, the arms or these types of things. So there's going to be perhaps emphasis of what is considered erotic in one culture versus another culture, even though they might both be Muslim.
Exactly, that you hit the nail on the head. And the reason why I think it's important and people understand the differences between the two is because some Muslims, when they pick up works written by Muslim scholars and they're speaking about erotology and they're speaking about what maybe some men prefer in terms of physical attributes in a woman, some people think this is what Islam says. So a number of the early Muslim scholars, they'll speak about, again, mainly within the Middle East, they'll speak about the beauties of white women and how they like fair-skinned women or women with dark black hair.
Right.
And some people pick this up and think, oh, this is a religion just endorsing only white women and saying that white women are the epitome of beauty, and not understanding that this is speaking from a subjective perspective of what people at the time found desirable and attractive in a woman. So I think it's important that people, and I'm understanding that there's a difference between what a particular Muslim from a certain culture considers to be attractive in a woman compared to what Islam says.
Right. No, that's a very good point.
It's important, and that's why I wanted to clarify, because unfortunately what's happening in the UK, I'm not sure if you've got the same phenomenon in America, is that there are some people who are, you could say like Pan-Africanists or black nationalists, who are picking some books or some passages from some Muslim scholars' works where maybe they talk about the beauties of white women, and they're saying, oh, look, the religion is racist because this scholar is speaking about how white women are desirable, the best women, blah, 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 and they're relating verses of poetry and not understanding that, yes, this come from the works of a Muslim scholar, but he's speaking about what he or the people at his time consider to be the most desirable in terms of like women, whether it's skin color, their weight. Muslims of today, we understand the context and the difference between sexuality and erotology, which we spoke about a little bit earlier.
Right. So erotology definitely includes this subjective desire or preference, which has nothing to do with actual sacred law. I mean, I know many people who don't find, for example, white people or very fair-skinned people to be attractive, or they prefer, different body masses versus other ones. I mean, that's really up to the personal preference, and usually that will reflect common patterns of eroticism and desire within the culture that they're from. So that's great clarification. Now, based on your book, and I do encourage everyone listening to read it and check it out, but maybe if you're still not married, you should wait because it can get a little rich. But
sorry to cut you off. To be honest, I mean, that's something that a number of people have said, and I've said that I think as Muslims, again, obviously, if there's some passages which are a bit too explicit or people are not comfortable with reading, then again, don't read it. But I think we as Muslims, we need to adopt an adult, a more of a mature perspective when we're talking about sex, because before someone gets married, they know about sex. And let's be honest with ourselves. And unfortunately, in many Muslim communities, that there's a number of people that are engaging in sexual contact before marriage. So to have this idea that until the person gets married, they're going to start reading about what Islam says about sex, I think that's something which is doing a disservice not only to them, but also to the religion. Because again, just because someone, I mean, when you watch a number of these Hollywood films, in every film there's got like a sex scene, so people are aware of sexual relations and things like that. Again, if there's some passages which some people find a bit too explicit or problematic, then I would say don't read it. But I would still, not just my book, but I'll still encourage people to kind of understand what the early Muslims and what Islam says in terms of our the approach towards sex and having a sex positive framework, rather than waiting until kind of they get married, because by that time their mindset and their attitudes towards sex and women might not be correct. And I think that's an issue that I wanted to kind of talk about in the book, because that's something that unfortunately a lot of Muslims have got this attitude towards women, which I don't think is very Islamic, in the sense of once you get married, the woman's supposed to do what you say in terms of fulfill your sexual desires and stuff like that, rather than understanding it's more about mutual pleasure and mutual benefit.
Right. No, I think that's a good correction, and I totally agree. I mean, I think we do need healthy Islamic sexual education, because I know for a fact that 75% plus of Muslims today aren't learning with any Islamic source or guidance. They're learning from pornography, they're learning online, they're learning from their friends, they're learning from just doing premarital relationships, right? So, of course, I think this is a book that can certainly begin this discourse amongst our communities. And, I guess I was saying that more so because I don't want people to, come around and say, oh, Karim told us to read this book, and somebody might be a 15-year-old listener out there, and then their parents will be mad at me. But I definitely agree that we need Islamic sexual education that's healthy and rooted in our tradition. And I think this book is a wonderful collection of doing that. or at least starting this subject matter, which who knows how long it'll take before it's actually part of our seminars and courses at the local mosque. I mean, we're still talking about the same things, at least, from what I see in our messages, but I haven't seen, for example, a course that talks about sexuality yet. And inshallah, this can be something that people start to harness in their local communities. But let's talk more about, from your research, how does Islam see sex? Is sex good? Maybe you can share a couple of points as to why you think we need to have a more holistic understanding of sex according to Islam, and how does it even have spiritual benefit?
Okay, so from the Islamic perspective, sex is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it could be a means of earning reward with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's a famous hadith in which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, just paraphrasing, he spoke about that saying subhanallah as a sadaqah, as a form of charity. And he said that even in in your private parts, there's a charity. And when the companions asked the Prophet, peace be upon him, are you saying that if we were to have sexual relations, like in terms of like if we were to enjoy sexual relations with our wives, we're going to be rewarded for that? Then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that if you was to have sexual relations with someone in a haram fashion, you'll be punished with it. You'll be punished by that. So it's educating them, it's telling them that we've all got this passion, we've all got this desire for sex. But if you engage in sexual relations in that which is obviously illegitimate, then obviously you're liable to be punished. If you're engaged in sexual relations in the correct framework, i.e. within marriage, Allah inshallah is going to reward you for it. So in terms of our understanding of sex, and even the word nikah, from the Arabic word nikah, the primary meaning is sexual intercourse. And that was the understanding of the early Muslims, that the reason why they get married, the primary reason is enjoying sexual pleasure, but obviously mutual sexual pleasure. And so the understanding of marriage was to do with sex. Whereas now, when you think about a lot of Muslims, when they think about marriage, even in the Western understanding, it's either procreation or more or less procreation to set up a family. So the early Muslims, this is something that I wanted to show, was their understanding about sex was pleasurable, and that's why there's like over 100 different words that the Arabs used for sex and their sexual organs. When Islam came, they codified it and they said, okay, sexual relations, we understand that with a number of people, this is like the highest source of pleasure, but it has to be done within the correct framework. Obviously, if it's done outside the correct framework, which is obviously marriage, then that's something obviously which is detrimental to your own self. And another quick hadith I want to quickly relate is when Aisha, when she spoke about, she said, if the first verse of the Quran was revealed, was saying, do not drink alcohol, do not fornicate, people would have continued to fornicate and would continue to drink wine. Whereas the early verses were speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the paradise, Jannah, and Nar, the hellfire. So people's hearts were attached to Allah and to the hereafter. And then when the verses were revealed, speaking about do not fornicate, do not drink wine, it was easy for people to give up these acts. And that's something, again, I think as Muslims, yes, we know that Islam is a sex-positive religion. It speaks about the benefits that you can have in terms of pleasing your wife, and likewise for the wife to please her husband. But ultimately, everything we're doing is for the sake of Allah. So if you've got in the back of your mind, and even as a man, so if you are pleasing your wife, and there's another hadith which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, before you have relations with your wife, send messages. And when they asked what is the sweet messages, he said sweet talk and kisses. It's about having this positive attitude, especially with the men, because a number of these hadiths were addressed to the men, informing them that don't be like a camel that goes to his wife, relinquishes first and then leaves. So you have to be someone that's trying to satisfy your wife as much as before you think about trying to satisfy yourself. Not only Muslim men, but men in general have this attitude that sex is just about themselves. Even if we look in the West, in the Western world, up until the 20th century, a lot of Western academics and in the medical profession, they believed that a woman couldn't have any sexual desire or even have an orgasm, and they labeled women as hysterics. And it's only in the last 150 years that now they've accepted that women can not only have an orgasm, can ejaculate, can enjoy sexual relations, when this was something that was affirmed by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam 1400 years ago.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, that's one of the things I've always appreciated about Islam, is this framing of sexuality as a worship, and not only as something that you do to please yourself, but it's also an act of service right, for your wife or for your husband. And I also work with a lot of brothers who are recovering from pornography addiction. And what's sad about those situations is many of our brothers and some sisters, they have now associated sexual pleasure and orgasms with shame and guilt and feeling horrible about themselves. And, you know, you have to remind them that imagine a space where you're enjoying sexuality and having orgasms, and it's associated with it's guilt-free. It's associated with worshiping Allah, with connecting to another human being, and it even has a spiritual and emotional depth to it that you can't experience through the synthetic joys of pornography addiction, for instance. So I'm really glad that you highlighted that, and it's something that we should all take to heart.
And just touching on the point you mentioned, about pornography, and the reason why I think, like we mentioned earlier, it's important for we as Muslims to engage in these conversations, these open and honest conversations about sex, even prior to marriage, because a lot of Muslims, they will be like, okay, I'm not going to have sex before marriage because it's haram, but I'll be watching pornography. And they can become addicted to pornography, and then their attitudes in terms of what sex is and is shaped by pornography, which we know is not real, and it's from a male perspective. So when they actually have sexual relations, it's not satisfying. And that's a problem. So that's why, again, if we adopt an approach where we're actually having these conversations way before, again, I'm not saying at a really young age, but way before even people are going to get married, they will realize that even lowering their gaze and not looking at pornography is for their own benefit. We know there's a number of studies that have come out talking about like the detrimental effects that significant pornography use has in terms of like in one's arousal process. And I think that's important. So people realize that me not doing these acts is not only, inshallah, obviously, for the sake of Allah, but for my own benefit as well. And I think that's something that we as Muslims kind of fail to realize.
Absolutely. No, it's a really good point. So this kind of maybe connects to, there's a couple of hot topics that I want to talk with you today about. So pornography, obviously, you know, I don't think we need to spend a lot of time showing or explaining how it is haram. It's bad for your soul. It's bad for your heart. It's bad for your sexuality. But it does also connect to this idea of masturbation. Right? So you get a lot of young men and even women now, they're like, well, this is ridiculous. How are we supposed to, not be married, not date, not have any relations, and stay chaste until we're 25, 30, sometimes 40 years old? I mean, the marriage age is getting pushed back more and more because of the socioeconomic expectations of, many places in the world, especially in the West. Now, this may not impact Muslims in other countries. I don't know, because I don't live in those countries. But, do you find that part of the rise of masturbation, using pornography, and even premarital sex happens more so with Muslims in societies where it's more difficult to get married, and so the haram is easier, and so this is what they're accessing? I mean, do you find, for instance, higher rates of pornography usage in countries where Muslims are still getting married at an earlier age, and perhaps there is more discourse around sexuality? Do you have any opinions or observations on that?
Yes, I do. I mean, there was a study I read, I think it was a year and a half ago, and the countries, three of the top 10 countries which have significant pornography use are Muslim majority countries. One was Saudi Arabia. I can't remember. I think one was Egypt. I can't remember the third.
Pakistan, I believe, from what I recall.
And this is the situation. Again, it comes to the attitude, because, I mean, there's not going to be a quick fix of someone getting married. I mean, because there's economic pressures, there's society pressures which prevent someone getting married at a young age, even though we know it's encouraged to get married at a young age. But that can't be solved overnight. But because people are adopting this attitude of okay, I've got these desires, rather than engaging in premarital sex, I'm going to engage in watching pornography and masturbating. The problem with that, and this is why I think people not only, again, just saying obviously it's haram, even in the Western world, amongst non-Muslims, there's been a number of studies where people have spoken about after a period of time, significant pornography use has affected their relationships, where they're no more aroused by a real woman. They're rather, watching pornography, and that's problematic. So I think when people kind of understand that, then they'll realize, okay, rather than saying, because I'm not married, I have to watch pornography. No, I'm not even going to watch pornography, because in the long term, that's going to do me damage as well. And I think that's why we need a more holistic understanding in terms of when we're looking at the issue of pornography, not just to say it's haram, but for people to understand the damaging effects it can have on the person on the long run. I think when people kind of realize that, then hopefully they'll be less likely to kind of engage in such acts.
Right, because, I mean, from my humble research and understanding, the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ruled as haram or evil is because it actually is bad for us, right? It's not because, there's any other reason other than it's actually going to cause damage and harm. And I think that if we don't have deeper holistic explanations and meaningful connections as to why certain things are prohibited in Islam versus not, it's never going to really sink in, right? It's just going to be seen as almost just impossible to fulfill some of these things. And this is something I hear with young Muslims. I mean, it's like, come on, how are we supposed to survive here? It's like we're not married. We're surrounded with sexualized societies. Half of our friends are doing it. Every time I want to get married, it's difficult sometimes. You don't find compatibility, or the mahr is too high. And it's like we're in a really tough situation, at least in some Western communities. Do you hear similar complaints in the UK as far as getting married is becoming more difficult for people?
Yes, most definitely. I think it's like one of the biggest fitnas that facing the Muslims, particularly in the West, or maybe even Muslims around the world, the difficulties of getting married. And I mean, there's no easy answer, but at the same time, I think just we can't say that, okay, because you can't get married, therefore go and engage in pornography or premarital relations. But at the same time, even if we look at during the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there was an example of when Abu Hudayfa, who was a companion but was poor, he came to the Prophet ﷺ and they said that he's finding difficulty to get married. What should he do? He fears that he's going to commit fornication. The Prophet ﷺ, and this is one of the beautiful hadiths, he didn't say anything to him. And he came to him again and he's saying, what should he do? And the Prophet replied that he said that know that the ink is dry. The pen, what you're going to do is you're going to be being written for you, not to validate or to say that what you're going to do is allowed, but this is maybe one of the trials that you're going to face. And this is something that a number of the Muslim scholars spoke about, that not everything, like, of course everyone's going to have a test and a trial, but sometimes I think we as Muslims, especially those that are struggling, we want like a rukhsa, like an easy way out for someone to say, okay, we know that because you're in a difficult situation, then you can go and commit pornography, then you can go and watch pornography, then you can go and have illicit relations, when in reality it's not allowed, and for the long run it's going to do detrimental harm. But sometimes the advice that we need to kind of give people, sometimes maybe not to say anything, but for them to realize that this is something that you're kind of going through. I know it's quite difficult to say because everyone wants a solution, an easy fix, but not everyone can get an easy fix. And another example was when the young companion went to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and he asked for the Prophet to make zina, fornication, halal for him. And a number of other companions were like, how dare you? How can you say such a thing? When the Prophet, again, his beautiful response was to call him, the young man, to come close to him, and he just asked him questions. Would you like that for your mother? And he said, by Allah, of course I wouldn't. Then he asked him, would you like that for your aunt? Would you like that for your sister and other female members of his family? In which he all replied that, of course, he wouldn't like that. Then he just said that the same way you don't like it for female members of your family, people don't like the same for the female members of their family. And he reasoned with him. So again, even that understanding, that approach, that's something that even as Muslim men, that, okay, you might be struggling, but that doesn't mean that should legitimize you having illicit relations with other women, because you wouldn't like if someone were to do that to like your daughter, your sister, your mother, and etc. So I think when people understand that, because even men that are the biggest, philanderers, womanizers, whatever, with their own women folk, they wouldn't like it. So we know it's wrong, but sometimes we need to understand why it's wrong by trying to bring in understanding. If someone were to do it to us, how would we feel?
Yeah, no, I love that reference. It's this idea of the Prophet ﷺ striking the human heart and humanizing the situation, not judging him or making him feel like he's cursed, but really just like you said, using the principle of logic and emotional intimacy to make that point. Because think about it, any guy out there or even woman who wants to do these things outside of marriage, you just think about your best friend who's also a guy, and he could think about your sister or your aunt or your mother in the same way, and that would make you feel disgusted. So what about you doing it to someone else's family member? I think that's a wonderful example of how the Prophet ﷺ, he was a counselor, and he did have wisdom in guiding these human aspects of our condition with a spiritual essence, so to speak. So let me ask you this though, Brother Habeeb. So let's talk about just masturbation, all right? So I think it's clear that We all know premarital sex, watching pornography, these are things that run the risk of being punished by Allah. It also causes a lot of physical and spiritual damage. But some people might say, well, how about if I can just masturbate? It's still the lesser of the two evils. I don't watch pornography, but I got a release. If I don't, it's just really going to impact my health and my ability to focus. What have you found in your research about the positions of masturbation in Islamic fiqh?
Some scholars that will say because it's the lesser of two evils and it's not outwardly haram, like Ahmad ibn Hanbal was of the opinion that it's not haram. So again, because there's obviously some scholars that say it's haram, but obviously not the same as having fornication or committing adultery. So because there's difference of opinion, and I'm not like a faqih or anything like that, I'm not going to say what is the correct opinion, but I can understand there's difference of opinion, but the person knows themselves. So if the person, like you said, is not watching pornography, but is just wants to masturbate as a form of release, I can understand that. I'm not going to criticize that person for doing that. If I'm in all honesty, there's some people who might take a different opinion, a more hardline stance, but for me, that is better than the person engaging in actual, sexual relations with people that they're not married to. So I can understand why the person would do that.
Mm-hmm. Now, some people have another solution, and they try to make it an Islamic one, this idea of temporary marriage. In other words, hey, it's better to have a temporary marriage, and at least it's sanctioned, rather than just have a girlfriend or a boyfriend. What are your thoughts about that?
Oh, wow. Okay, that is a very controversial topic, and I'm glad you brought that up. I'm very troubled by that, and the reason why is because even when I was in Egypt and I came back, a number of brothers, when I was first looking to get married, a number of brothers, and these educated brothers know the Quran inside out, well versed in fiqh, they were saying, go and have a temporary marriage, even when I said I know I'm not committed because I'm going back to Egypt to this woman, and she obviously wants to stay in the UK. They were saying it's fine as long as you don't express it outwardly that you're only doing it for a certain period of time. It's better than committing fornication or adultery. Now, my issue with this is that technically, quote unquote, it's halal, but it goes against the spirit of the law. It goes against the spirit of the law because what happens generally in a lot of these marriages is that the women aren't aware of what the man's intentions are. So he might be engaging in sexual relations for however long, couple of weeks, couple of months, even maybe a couple of years, and then leaves her and then goes off and does his own thing, whether he goes back to his own country, whatever. Now, I've seen a lot of women who have left the religion of Islam. It's affected their iman because of this. So it's like you could say it's a form of spiritual abuse, and that's what I strongly go against this type of reason. I can understand why some men do it, but because I've seen the effects on the other side with a number of women who've either left Islam or stopped practicing, I can't endorse that at all. Quite prevalent, unfortunately, among some Muslim communities that kind of give this, and again, it comes from this male understanding that his sexual desires or his sexuality is more important. The damage that he's going to do to the Muslim woman, it doesn't matter, and I think that's very problematic. That's why I couldn't really endorse that. And I'm really against that type of marriage because I think you're really abusing the religion for your own kind of benefit.
Yeah, and I mean, even just your explanation there and why you don't feel very comfortable with that position. I mean, you said something that struck me, this idea of, well, technically it's halal, but it goes against the spirit of the law. I mean, I find that to be an issue, that you have positions by certain imams or even scholars that say things like that. It's almost like as long as you can hide how you're not really going to be with them, this is okay. But I mean, doesn't that go against the concept of ikhlas, sincerity, and sidq, and truthfulness, which are part of Islamic character? I don't see how you can have something be Islamic, technically okay or valid according to the sacred law, but yet it goes against the spirit of the law or akhlaq of Islam. I mean, what are your thoughts about that?
I'm sorry, by me saying it's halal, it's like in inverted commas, quotations, not to say that it's actually halal. I believe that it's haram. Like if you're looking at, if someone were to ask, okay, did it fulfill the conditions of marriage, which a lot of, religious scholars are just looking at the conditions of marriage and what it says. Did you have two witnesses? Did you have a mahar? Did you have the acceptance? Did you have the offer? Because it fulfills those four conditions, then they'll be like, okay, technically it's halal. We're becoming the Muslims who are not really trying to understand Islam holistically. We're just looking at, does it fulfill the parameters of the law into the fiqh? And I think that's why it's problematic. You can't prove that that's the reason why he got married, if you understand what I'm getting at. But if the person knows himself within his heart that he's not committed to this woman, and he knows that he's just there for maybe a couple of months, couple of years, then you shouldn't do that. No one needs to tell you that. But a faqih can't prove that. That's why you can't invalidate that marriage. And again, that's why it's something which, again, it wasn't as prevalent as it was maybe 5 to 10 years ago in the UK, but it was prevalent amongst some Muslim communities where a number of brothers not only in the UK, was, marrying women, especially when they go abroad. It was prevalent in some parts of Egypt when I was studying, that brothers will come, and again, you're going to, you're meeting this woman's family, and you're taking advantage because you've got money as well. And I saw this a lot amongst a lot of Muslims, from not only from the UK but from America as well, who marry young Egyptian women. They know they're only going to be there for a year, a couple of years whilst they're doing their studies, and then they'll go back and they'll just divorce them. And even to get that marriage was quite difficult in the first place, because they might have had some pushback from her family. But again, because of the money, they were able to, give their parents or give their family something to sweeten them up. They get married after a couple of years, even sometimes she has a child with them, and they just go back to their respective countries. For me, again, because you're doing so much damage, but again, because they're saying, oh, technically, I fulfill the conditions of marriage, but they know it's wrong. Do you understand? Because it's difficult to disprove. That's why I'm saying technically, in inverted commas, it's halal, but really and truly, we know that it's haram. So I'm glad you actually said that, because I don't want people to get the impression that I'm saying that those marriages or those unions are technically marriages when they're really not at all.
No, thank you for clarifying that. And I mean, I've also counseled situations where sisters would contact me and their husbands got a second wife, and they use the same idea, right? That, well, they found some scholarly input that says you don't have to tell your wife about your second wife or third wife. You don't have to let them know, because this is a right that you have from Allah. So basically, as long as you're following the fiqhi process, it's considered legit or verified. But then for many sisters, it's the same thing as the man having an affair, because he's been lying, he's been going behind her back, he's been making up stories, and he has a whole other family and woman that he's married to. So what are your thoughts about that? Because those brothers also ruining this idea of polygamy in a healthy, holistic way, which I think is very attainable and has been exemplified by people and certainly some of our prophets.
Maybe because of the background I've come from, and I've seen polygamy being practiced in the correct way, where the husband is very open and honest and with his wife and prospective wives that he's going to marry. So I haven't got an issue with polygamy, and I'm an advocate for polygamy. But like the practice which you described, which unfortunately is prevalent in a number of Muslim countries, and especially in the Western world, I have a problem with that as well. Because yes, again, if you were to go to the books, technically the man doesn't need to inform his wife. But again, how can you be in a relationship with someone and you're deceiving them? And as Muslims, that is one of the qualities which, when the Prophet ﷺ was asked, can a Muslim be a miser? He said, yes. Can a Muslim fornicate? He said, yes, it's possible for a Muslim to fornicate. Can a Muslim steal? He said, yes, it's possible for a Muslim to steal. And then they asked, can a believer lie? He said, no, that's the one thing a believer can't do. So that's the essence of Islam. And that's something, again, as we as Muslims, we seem to, we've become, when I mean by people of the book, I'm not referring to the Jews and the Christians. I mean, we've become we're just nitpicking, and we're trying to see how we can abuse the law to suit our own desires, rather than understanding, that if you're in a union with someone and it's built on love and trust and respect, how can you be lying to this person? You don't need to go to a scholar, you don't need to go to an alim for this. You know this yourself, that it's wrong. And that's why I just have an issue with people that's trying to find these religious loopholes, because if you want to find a loophole, you can, but ultimately it's wrong, and Allah will take you into account for that. That's why I think to do, because it's difficult as an imam, a counselor, or a faqih, or anyone, if you're in that situation, to say to them, because there's nothing clear in Islamic, from what I'm aware of, Islamic text, which says that a man that needs to tell his wife that he's going to marry a second wife, right? So I'm not going to say that you have to say that, when I haven't come across anything which does say that you need to. But at the same time, how can you be in a marriage and you think that's acceptable practice as a Muslim? You shouldn't even cheat a non-Muslim, let alone your wife that you're living with. Do you understand? So, and the harm that you're going to do, we know as Muslims we shouldn't do harm to anyone. How can you be doing, I'm not talking about physical harm, but even emotional harm? How can you be doing that to your wife and you think that is an acceptable practice as a Muslim man? We need to kind of understand Islam again, like I mentioned earlier, from a more holistic perspective, as opposed to thinking about, am I ticking the box of what is halal and what is haram, so to speak.
Polygamy is a big topic for a lot of people, and I think that it's unfortunately had a very bad rap, especially because of these misused processes that some of our brothers have done in the past. And maybe you can tell us more about healthy versions of polygamy that you've observed and witnessed, because nowadays I find it so fascinating. I mean, with a lot of, certain unhealthy constructs coming from feminism. Women have misandry towards men. There's this hate for men. Men are pigs. All you guys care about is sex. And, polygamy is backwards, and, all this stuff. And it's like, subhanAllah, you have Muslims now, at least, in some parts of the world, in the West, where they're more willing to be advocates for homosexual marriage, but they're totally against polygamy, which I find fascinating. Why do you think that there is this ruling for men and not for women? Because this is something that you have some modern women say, like, oh, that's not fair. It should go both ways. And if it doesn't, then the man's not allowed to do it either. Can you tell us more about this idea of healthy polygamy according to Islam, and how this can actually be a beautiful practice of the Sunnah and not just some backwards or hurtful engagement?
Okay, in terms of from an Islamic perspective, we know that not only the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but a number of the prophets, like Dawood alayhi salam and Sulaiman alayhi salam, and also many of the companions, they were polygamous. They had multiple wives. So from an Islamic standpoint, I don't think anyone could say that polygamy is like a bad practice, so to speak. Now, even within, and then there's some Muslims, especially like feminists and especially Muslim women, will say, oh, that was then, and that was because of the time, because there was wars and things like that, whereas now it's not practical. Now, the reality is, and this, I know some women might not like to hear this, but the reality is there are some parts of the world, and even in the West as well, in the United States and the UK, where women are more than happy to engage in a polygamous, to be in a second wife or third wife. I think, and that's something that a lot of women aren't, for whatever reason, they've got their own reasons, they do not want to accept. And if you were to ask, like the women that you said, why is it fair that a man can have a number of wives, whereas a woman can't? If you ask most women, and there's been studies which I mentioned in the book which I've related, which was conducted amongst non-Muslims, but even if you ask a lot of, just do a sample study of people that you know, how many women would be comfortable or wouldn't mind having multiple sexual partners? A lot of women would be disgusted by that idea. If you ask honestly whether they're religious, not religious, whether they got a beard down to their belly button or not, whether they're practicing, not practicing, you ask a number of men, how many of them would like to have multiple sexual partners? And they'll probably, if they don't say yes, they'll have a wry smile on their face because they would like that. That's just the reality of the way Allah has created us. And that's something that, again, that's something that the early Muslims were aware of. But again, it doesn't mean that you can just marry as many women as you like and take advantage of them. But that's a desire that a number of men, not all, but a number of men would like to have multiple sexual partners. And hopefully you do within the confines of marriage. And that's not a desire for a number of women. Now, because a lot of women don't have that desire, how can you, what I always try to speak to women is that if you don't naturally have that desire, but a man does naturally have that desire, how can you say that it's not fair for a man to have multiple women unless a woman does, when for most women, that's not their natural desire. They wouldn't want to have multiple women. They just want a man to have one partner and that's it, because that's all they would like.
Right. Yeah, no, this is a really good point. I think we shouldn't also reduce it down to just sexual desire here. It's also about, I personally believe, a man does have the capacity to truly love more than one woman, whereas many women, it's so hard for them to conceptualize that because they are wired, most of them are wired to actually only love one man because it gives them that sense of security. So when they try to reverse the psychology, it's inconceivable to them to have 3 husbands. So for them, it's like, how the heck can a man do this? And if he does, it means he doesn't really love me. And I think this is a really important point, that no, a man actually can love you and honor you and still love another woman and honor her, which is why the verses in the Quran that talk about this say, have equity with your wives, right? And if you fear that you can't, then yeah, stick with one. But that doesn't mean that it's not possible or that men don't have the capacity to do it. Because I always hear this argument of, see, the Quran even says be monogamous. It's like, no, the Quran says have equity. And equity is based on the relationship parameters itself. I mean, often we take it and we think it means absolute equality, right? Like, oh, if you spend, number of days a week here, you got to do it here. If you buy her this, you buy her that. But it really comes down to the actual wife and what they want and what they feel is equitable. If one wife is satisfied with seeing you twice a week, you don't have to force her to spend 3 days a week with you because you spend 3 with the other one, right? It's about the equity of the relationship dynamics and what's the agreed upon fulfillment of needs. This idea of, well, since you can't be absolutely equal in everything, you're overlooking the fact that it's about equity, not pure equality, and that you can still have fulfillment and people can still be happy in these situations.
No, I agree. Very valid point. I agree with everything that you said. I can't But it's just one of those. This is one of the topics where, as two men speaking about why polygamy is like we're never going to win. I'll be honest with you. For women listening to it, I don't really talk too much about polygamy because as a man, naturally, you're coming from a male perspective and you're just looking at the benefits it is for a man, as opposed to like, and I can understand why most women wouldn't want to be in a polygamous relationship. There are some societies, not only society, there are some women, and I think a lot of women themselves don't recognize this, that there are some women who would be happy to be a second wife. Now, the issue generally comes to the first wife, because generally, obviously, when the first wife gets marries the husband, unless she's from a society where it's kind of the norm that a man might marry second or third, she's under the assumption that she's going to be the only wife. Now, when another woman comes on board, it's like the man has done a disservice to her. So I can understand why those women have an issue with it. But there are some women who are happy to be a second wife. There's some women that are happy to be a third wife, and there are some women who are, even if they get married and they're the first wife, they know there's a possibility that the man can marry again, and they haven't got an issue with it. And again, coming from a Nigerian background where it's not unusual, and that's why, like, speak again. I'm not saying all Nigerian women are happy with polygamy, but a number aren't. There isn't this issue like when I hear a lot of women complaining, whether it's in the UK or America, that no woman would like to be in a polygamous relationship. And I'm thinking, you can't say that because there's women that's more than happy to be in this relationship that are living today, and to make it out as if that they're oppressed and they don't know any better, that's, to me, that's quite patronizing. The same way some non-Muslims speak about Muslim women as being oppressed because they're wearing a hijab and things like that. Who are you, as just because maybe you are not comfortable with it, that's fine. But then to say that no woman should engage in to be part of such a union, that's ridiculous, because there's some women who are more than happy and they've got their own reasons. And it's not just because, like we hear some people say a lot, unless the woman can't have children, then it's a reason why he can marry a second wife. No, there's a number of reasons, and we shouldn't limit it because Allah didn't say this is the reason. So who's it for me or anyone else to say, unless the first wife can't have any children, or because of X or because of Z, that's the reason why a man can marry a second wife. As long as he can, like you mentioned, be equitable amongst them and they're happy with the arrangement, I don't see what is an issue with it. And I think we as Muslims, we need to kind of realize that just because you might not want to engage in such an act, it doesn't mean, and it's halal, it doesn't mean that you should forbid it for someone else who might be a more than perfect situation for their situation, for whatever circumstance they're in.
Right. And I mean, I would argue, especially those Muslims who are advocates for same-sex marriage, love is love, right? It's like all the same rules that apply to two men wanting to be together or two women to want to be together. You can't actually argue against any of those points if you're going to use it in a polygamous situation. I mean, who are you to say who's going to be happy and who's going to experience love and fulfillment if they actually want to embark on a polygamous family? Right? I mean, that's up to the participants. I mean, tolerance has to go both ways, doesn't it? But unfortunately, it doesn't, usually with the politics and other agendas behind the scenes.
So just one quick point, just adding to what you've said. I think the reason why people might be for same-sex relations but against polygamy, it comes down to, even Muslims, it comes down to the concept of love. Because a lot of Muslims, again, I think this has been adopted from the West, this understanding of true love. Man can only love one person, a woman can only love one person, this idea of soulmates. We've adopted this from this romantic ideal from the Western world in terms of what love is. So because people have adopted this understanding of love, and I think women generally have this understanding that they only can love one person, again, I'm not saying all women, but a lot love only one person at a time, they assume this is the case for men as well. They can understand or accept or tolerate same-sex relations because it's just love, one person loving another person. Whereas polygamy, their understanding, again, is like, how can a man love multiple women? And I think that's what it comes down to. The crux of the matter is the concept of love. And I think if you were to ask people, this concept of love that people have, where do you get it from? It doesn't generally come from the Islamic tradition. Because if it did, are we saying that the Prophet ﷺ didn't love his wives? Because of course we know he did.
Right. And also, of course, there are men out there that they're not interested in polygamy. They're more happy and fulfilled with monogamy, right? And more power to them. And there's nothing wrong with that. I also think that just because polygamy is allowed in Islam, it also doesn't mean that it's supposed to be easy or sisters are necessarily going to like it, right? That's fine, because you're still a human being, and it's not easy to be in a polygamous relationship for some people, especially if it's not done with wisdom and character and virtue. So I also, want to say that sometimes it's really sad from certain situations I've worked with. I've counseled some sisters in polygamous situations, and what's sad is some of the brothers who are doing this, they use the whole, again, the Islam card, right? Well, Allah said I'm allowed to do it, so you should like this, or you shouldn't have a problem with this. And they forget the humanistic, emotional art to this, that you can't expect that your wife is going to be comfortable with this at first, right? Especially if it's not something she's used to and it's not embedded in her culture. You can't expect a woman to be okay with this, and it's going to take time to adjust, right? And so I think men also have to be more heartfelt in this idea of, well, because there's an Islamic sanction, therefore I shouldn't, hear any complaining and everyone should just deal with it kind of thing. But that's not holistic, and it certainly doesn't exemplify the character of our prophets that we're trying to follow.
Yeah, most definitely. And we even know that the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't marry some women because they were extremely jealous. Because even during his period when polygamy was accepted, there's some women who couldn't handle it. So that's something that I think we as men, we need to be more compassionate with our sisters and realize that we're living in a time, and especially in the West, where polygamy is not the norm. So if you understand that's the reality, and a lot of women don't, if you're marrying a woman and she doesn't think that she's ever going to be part of a polygamous relationship, I think it's best either you let her know beforehand that could be a possibility, or you don't get involved in marrying a second or third wife, because again, it can do a lot of, like you could say, spiritual harm as well to her. Not only, and again, like you said, you have to understand how she is from a human being perspective, not only just like Islamically, it's allowed, therefore I can do what I like.
Right. Right. Now, one of the things that I often try to help some couples with, I mean, it depends on the couple. Some are more open to talk about sexuality, others aren't. But I think it's very important to invest in our sexuality within marriage. And this can take different forms, and I think that some people assume that there's a lot of things you're just not allowed to do between husband and wife. And from my understanding, and also from what you have in your book, according to Islamic law, there's only two things that the Prophet ﷺ forbade explicitly between husband and wife. One is sexual relations through the anus, and second is sexual relations during intercourse during the menstrual cycle of the woman. However, you can still have other sexual intimacy even when a woman's on her menses. So these are the two things that I'm aware of, which brings us to a very common question, which I also get, and you covered in your book, about this idea of oral sex. And so there's two types. There's, of course, fellatio, which is oral sex from a woman to a man. And then there's cunnilingus, which is the oral pleasuring of the man towards the woman's private parts. So can you tell us more about what you found in your research about how this has been addressed in Islamic scholasticism?
Okay, so there's a difference of opinion amongst the Muslim scholars, but generally, generally most Muslim scholars are of the opinion that it's permissible. There are some so generally, like in terms of the full schools of Islamic law, the Hanbalis, the Malikis, and Shafi'is are generally of the opinion that it's permissible. I haven't really come across many notable scholars that actually said that it's haram. You find even some modern day scholars, which I want to quickly talk about, that say that even though it's not haram, it's something that is disgusting. It's something that is an act of, like I've heard scholars say, it's something that only dogs do or people in the West. It's because of their culture. So maybe because in some cultures that it's not widely practiced, that's why some men will say it as, why would you do that? Or some people will say, the mouth is what you use to recite the Quran, you recite to eat. How can you use, and again, if that's just not what you like doing, or you don't think it's acceptable, that's fine, but you can't say it's haram. And generally, even the Muslim scholars that generally who do not like the practice, they don't say it's haram outwardly. There's very few scholars I've come across, whether traditional scholars or contemporary scholars, that said it's haram. And there's many contemporary scholars like Yusuf Qaradawi that spoke about it and didn't say that it's outright forbidden. Now, I would argue again with a lot of men, because even if we talk about sex and orgasm for men is one and the same. And what I mean by that is, if a man has sex, 9 times out of 10 he's going to have an orgasm. Whereas with a woman, sex and orgasm is not the same, and that's something that I think many men do not realize. That a lot of women, even that have sex, do not reach an orgasm, which is unfortunate. Even if we're just looking at through penetrative intercourse, only 30% of women actually can attain a climax through penetrative intercourse. So therefore, what does that mean? As a man, in order to please your woman, you might need to, whether it's manual stimulation with the fingers, or you might need to engage in oral stimulation in order for her to achieve a climax. Because most women, just through penetrative intercourse, do not achieve a climax. But again, this comes to a lot of men having a lack of understanding about female sexuality and the female sexual arousal process. So they think from their perspective, because I'm getting satisfied, so she surely should be getting satisfied. Some women aren't satisfied just with penetrative intercourse. So again, so for me, and that's why I'm a very strong advocate for oral sex. Again, if a man's not comfortable with doing it, then don't do it, or vice versa. But if you want to please your wife, and a number of women find oral sex actually more pleasurable than actual penetrative intercourse, then why shouldn't you do it? And again, especially if it's something that's going to bring her pleasure. Again, like I said, if people have issues with it because culturally they find it something that is not acceptable, or the women don't like it themselves, then it's fine. But to make it out as if it's a disgusting act, it's just something that comes from the West or dogs, that's wrong. That's not Islamic at all. That's just some people's culture manifestations that they're uncomfortable with some practices. And this is something that is not only a recent phenomenon, it's something which happened in early Muslim communities where they spoke about, like Imam al-Qurtubi, he mentioned about that, because with the Hanbalis, there were some scholars that said that even looking at a woman's private parts can cause blindness. That's what there were some fabricated traditions attributed to the Prophet, peace be upon him, where he said that if you look at a woman's private parts, it can cause you blindness. So some of the Maliki scholars that were refuting this, and they were saying that this is a fabricated tradition, that a man can look at a woman's private parts, he can even lick her private parts. So this is an example that is saying that it's perfectly permissible. Some Muslims, especially those, I've noticed a number of Muslim scholars from the Indian subcontinent, in many of their books talking about sexual relations and things like that, they've disapproved of this practice. They might have not said it's haram, but they said that in terms of to be like pious and what's good practice and good ethics, you shouldn't like engage in such practices. But again, that comes from cultural understandings of what is so-called like inappropriate or appropriate sexual behavior. But even if we were to look at during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, we know that even amongst the people of Mecca and the people of Medina, they had different understandings in terms of what types of sexual behavior is permissible. So, like for example, with Umar ibn Khattab, who was from Mecca, when he migrated with the Muslims to Medina, and then he married a woman who was from Medina, he wanted to engage in a sexual position where, from behind, obviously not in her vagina, and obviously not through her anus, but he wanted to penetrate her from behind. And she said, no, we don't do this. And then he went to the Prophet ﷺ to complain. He said, he's describing that he wanted to enter his wife from behind, not through the anus, but she said that that this is not acceptable practice. That he wanted clarification whether this is Islamic. And then the Prophet mentioned that you can enter your wife in whichever way you like, as long as you don't enter through the anus. It shows that even amongst the Muslims, there are different understandings of what is kind of considered to be acceptable and not acceptable. Now, the reason why a number of the people of Medina thought that having sexual relations from behind was seen as not a good practice was because the Jews at the time, they said that if your child will become deformed or become blind or cross-eyed. So this was understand that they had, and they got influenced by this. So it just shows that, again, people are products of our environment. And again, it's some of the external factors that kind of affect our attitude or shape our attitudes in terms of what's acceptable or not acceptable practices. We've been influenced by, again, different factors. But again, coming to oral sex or oral stimulation, if a man and a woman's comfortable with it, then it's not haram from what I understand. But if a man is uncomfortable and his wife wants it, then I think the man should step up and actually go and do the deed. I know that might sound a bit graphic, but I think, again, it comes to understanding trying to please your wife is the most important thing, and vice versa. But again, if the man wants it but the woman doesn't, then maybe the man needs to be a bit more sympathetic, and he shouldn't force her. I think that's the most important thing. It's not about having a dictatorship, but if people are worried thinking that this is un-Islamic or this is a practice of dogs and things like that, that's something which is not correct. I think that's something that we need kind of clarification with, because I hear that a lot. That's one of the questions many people ask: is oral sex allowed? Because they think it's just for the West or dirty people. And again, that's not true.
Right. No, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that gives us also the context of a certain verse in the Quran that was revealed which talked about this, right? Enter your wives in any direction that you want, right? This idea of as long as it's not in the anus, then you can have different sexual positions, so to speak, right? So this also circles us back to this difference between sexuality and erotology. Sexuality in Islamic law is those two things are haram, and then erotology now could probably consider some of these things like oral sex, different positions that is common in the culture or expected, and so on and so forth. Would you say that's accurate?
Exactly, that you've hit the nail on the head.
Brother Habeeb, so far it's been a very fascinating discussion on very pertinent topics here, and I wanted to also pick your brain a bit more about this idea of investing in sexuality between spouses. So one thing that I notice is we don't really take the time or effort or thought to really think about how do we improve our sexual relations in marriage. And I mean, my whole thing is, I mean, we're living in times, especially in the West, where society is overly sexualized. The haram is easier than the halal. We've got pornography at our fingertips. There's many men and women out there that are willing to do haram things with you, even when they're Muslim. And then it's like, you know, we're assuming that some of these one-dimensional sexual practices between Muslim men and women in marriage is really going to have long-term sustainability, so to speak. And I always say, I mean, come on, we're living in times where we've got all kinds of dark sexual energy pulling us away from what is true, good, and beautiful and halal. And we have to counter that with practices and ideas and passion within our marriage to make it more fulfilling, spicy, enjoyable, and something that we actually look forward to. And I know in your book you talk a lot about this and give real practical tips on improving eroticism in marriage. And I'd love to hear your thoughts more about why you think this is so important and what are a couple of tips that maybe you can share with the audience.
So in terms of, I think it's important that we keep the fire alive in our relationships. And one practical or a couple of practical points or tips that we can give people is to rather than going straight to sexual relations itself, engage in foreplay. And obviously that can come in different forms. And one of the forms which I think is very beneficial, hopefully not only to the man but to the woman as well, is to engage in sensual massages. And this is something that is not only erotic both for the woman but for the man as well. It's very stimulating. So when I'm talking about erotic massages, there's a chapter I've got called sensual massage, a practice called sensate focus, which was developed by a couple of Christian sexologists, where they spoke about the importance of whether the man or the woman performing an erotic massage or sensual massage, shall I say, on their partner, but not touching any of the genital areas. Because sometimes especially as a man, if you're concentrating first and foremost on the genital areas or the breast, for example, then you're going to be highly aroused. But rather, you're trying to make the practice pleasurable for the woman, where it's not just about sex, and even for the man as well. Because I think generally, a lot of times when we think about sex, we're going straight to, I think in America, you've got 4 bases or whatever. You're going to the last base, you're going straight to actual penetration itself, when in reality, we should spend more time in foreplay as well. And I think it's very important for the woman as well, but for the man to engage in foreplay, whether it's cuddling, kissing, even mental foreplay, which is, again, I think that's a skill or lost art that many people aren't aware of. So when we're talking about sexual relations, it starts even before the actual physical act. It could be when you're at work, she's at work, you're sending text messages. It's little subtle things, maybe leaving sweet messages on the fridge, but it's letting the person know that you're in their thoughts. And I think that's something that's very important. And again, that's something that obviously after a number of years of marriage, I can understand you get familiar with each other, and it's about trying to keep that spark alive, how it was when you first got married and things like that. So I think that's important, but it's having that mindset, because if you're just thinking about sex as it's just a chore rather than a pleasure, then that's going to affect in terms of how your intimate relations. But if you're thinking about, okay, let me make this a bit exciting, it doesn't mean you need to, like do role play and dress up as different people like some people teach in non-Muslim communities, but rather just doing certain practices that is prolonging the experience.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it just really helps with that whole build-up and connectivity emotionally, physically, before you have sexual relations. And usually when you have healthy foreplay and these types of erotic acts together, the sex itself is amplified and more pleasurable. And something that's interesting that I hear sometimes from brothers in counseling is this idea of, my wife isn't always in the mood. And I always say, but brother, she doesn't have to be in the mood every time you are, and she probably won't be because you guys are different. But a part of a man's job is also to be romantic and to warm the woman up. And most of the time, women might say, I'm not in the mood, but if the man knows how to make her feel special and beautiful and desirable, within 10 minutes, she's going to be on board. Right? So we as men also have to recognize that eroticism and also making our women feel loving and beautiful, it's going to also impact their capacity and interest to have sex with us as well. And it can go the other way around, of course.
Yeah, I agree. But a lot of that comes down to or stems from the misunderstanding that many men have about female sexuality. Because like you said, a lot of men will complain that my wife is not in the mood. And it's not that she's not in the mood, is that you're not able to understand.
Yeah, you don't know how to get her in the mood sometimes.
And that's the reality. It's some hard truths that some men maybe don't want to hear, but that's the reality. It's not that your wife is not in the mood, or she's cold, or she doesn't feel like she wants to have sex, you're not doing a good job of making her feel desired. You're just going straight for the end game, when rather than trying to make her feel desired and wanted, then she'll really be in the mood and she'll show you. But again, that's where a lot of the onus I'll place on men, and they need to take responsibility rather than complaining. It's because of your mindset. So I think it's important that men have changed their mindset and have a mindset where they're trying to pleasure the woman, not only physically but mentally as well, because we know that, like, and there's hadiths that mention that a woman's capacity for sexual enjoyment is 9 times more stronger than a man. It's one of the best feelings that you can have. But again, if you're a man that's very selfish and you're thinking about yourself, you're not concerned with any of that. As much as I'm talking a lot about men, it's the same. The same goes with women as well. That some women need to understand what is it that the man likes. As you know, that most men were visual creatures. So even if it's something like wearing some sexy lingerie, perfume, keeping herself in shape. I know it's difficult, especially after some women have children. But if she's got the mindset that, no, I want to please my husband, then hopefully she'll try her best to keep this up. Whereas if she's looking at sex as this is just something I'm doing just to have children, or just to kind of keep him quiet, then she's not going to be doing these little things to entice him. So that's why it's about having a sex positive mindset that both the man and the woman needs to have.
Right. It's not also just another religious obligation, right? And that takes away that human and spiritual and emotional element to it, right? I just do this because it's my job as a Muslim woman, so to speak, right? So, but it's also kind of, sometimes it goes the other way around, where women are more sexually charged and more interested and the man isn't. What are your thoughts about that? Do you think this also has to do with, I mean, of course there are a number of reasons from what I've observed in some of the cases I've worked with, but what are some of your thoughts about why sometimes it's the other way around, where the woman is like, my man is just, he's not interested, he's not available, and I go to him and I try to get him in the mood and he's just not that responsive?
Yeah, that's quite interesting, because that was one of the discussions that a number of the early Muslim scholars used to debate amongst themselves, who's got the strongest sexual desire, is it men or women? And a number of the Muslim scholars were of the opinion that women have got a stronger sexual desire than men. And there's a hadith, there's debates in terms of the authenticity, but I'll relate it anyway, that women have got a capacity for sexual relations and is 99 times more stronger than a man, but Allah has placed haya over her, like modesty over, which prevents her from acting out on her desires like a man would. And this is that because of that hadith, that's why a number of the Muslim scholars, and as well as the story between Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam and Al-Aziz, his wife, that accused him of trying to seduce her, that they were of the opinion that women have got a stronger sexual desire than men. They used to debate it amongst themselves, and then they will give examples of some women who had a far stronger sexual desire than men. And that's something that some men will boast and claim that they want a woman that's highly sexualized or has got a strong sexual desire, but some men are intimidated by this. And again, so when we're talking about sexual desire, generally we make it as if men have got a stronger sexual desire than women, when there are in fact some women who've got a stronger sexual desire than men, and the men can't keep up. And that's something that even as Muslims we need to be comfortable having these conversations. And this is a reality that some women might want a divorce from her husband because he's not able to fulfill her desires, and that's a legitimate reason for her to have a divorce. So it's something that it depends. Not all women are the same. They're not monolithic, nor men are monolithic. But generally, unfortunately, we just mainly talk about as if men always want to have sex, when in reality, that some women have got a stronger sexual desire, but the situations that a number of men, like you mentioned earlier, aren't able to arouse them.
Right, and I think it's important for the audience to remember that we're talking about general patterns and populations. We're not talking about everybody out there. There's of course a variety of different cases. You have women that want sex more than men. You have a lot of men who want more sex than women, and you also have men and women that aren't that interested in sex as much as other people. So it all depends on the person you are, the person you happen to be married to, and this has to do, of course, with personality and your energy. So of course we're speaking again about general patterns here. Well, the last thing, I can pick your brain all day because this book is really awesome, and I recommend everyone to check it out. We're going to have a link for it on the show. But the last thing I wanted to talk to you about, brother, is sexuality in Jannah, in paradise. So some people get at Islam, from the outside of the community. They go like, what's up with your religious book? It talks about sex and paradise and maidens and young boys and all this stuff. And of course, you have sometimes, Muslim women go, how come men have hur al-ain, the maidens of paradise, what do we get? Especially the women who maybe have a higher sexual drive, and this is something that they also enjoy and value about their life and their reward. Why don't you tell us a bit more about that? Why do you think sexuality is mentioned in paradise, and the Quran refers to this as one of the rewards for men and women?
Because, like we mentioned earlier, if he was going to be honest and ask, especially men, what do they find the most pleasurable thing in life? Sex will probably be amongst the most pleasurable thing if men are honest, whether they're religious or not religious. And also women as well that have experienced orgasm. Many of the scholars mentioned it's because sexual pleasures is probably the most desirable thing that the human being wants or desires in this world. Of course, it makes sense that that's something that you're going to thrive, that you would like in paradise. And we as Muslims as well, we shouldn't be afraid or ashamed of our religion. We shouldn't be ashamed of non-Muslims attacking us because there's sensual aspects mentioned in paradise, because that's something which even during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, a number of the Jews tried to criticize him and the Muslims that how come you're speaking about eating food and drink and having sexual relations in the hereafter? Because we know the Christian and their understanding of paradise is that your spirits and you don't even eat, you don't drink, you don't engage in sexual relations. Whereas from the Islamic perspective, we believe that yes, you're going to we'll eat food, inshallah, we'll drink, and we'll engage in sexual relations. So that's something that we shouldn't be ashamed of, and I just want to make that clear in the beginning. In terms of, like we mentioned earlier, for most men, or I don't say most, but to say a lot of men, they have got innate desire for sexual variety. If you ask a lot of men honestly, would they like to have multiple sexual partners? They would like that. Now, if that's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed for men to have in the hereafter, I'm speaking to men would love that. Now, some women, a lot of women, for example, wouldn't like that because they're thinking, why is it he's allowed that? But if you ask a lot of women, like I mentioned earlier, would they want that for themselves? They wouldn't. So I can't understand that when I speak to some women, why is it that you have this issue with a man having multiple sexual partners when, from what many of the scholars said, that the issues of like jealousy that many women feel in this world is going to be removed for them. You're not going to be bothered by your husband having multiple sexual partners. So the fact that yes, he's monogamous, maybe monogamous with you in this world, and then he has multiple sexual partners, again, for a lot of women, it's a traumatic just thought. But what a number of the scholars they mentioned is that the issues that women have, like in terms of jealousy and things like that, that's going to be removed from their heart. Now, then the next question, which you might ask, or some women I'm sure are thinking, is, what about, do we get hura'in? Now, I haven't read anything. There's nothing mentioned in the Quran. I've not read anything from hadiths or scholars that mention that women are going to get an equivalent. And I'm not going to sit here and say that women are also going to have hura'in, because that's not my place to say that. But what a number of the Muslim scholars did say is that the women will be monogamous with their one husband, but they will be satisfied. Again, it's a controversial topic because, again, the time we're living in now, that it's this idea of equality, and some women are claiming that everything that a man's got, they should have, even if that's not what they desire. So it's just, again, it's something that I don't talk about too much because some people can't get their head around it, and I don't want to cause fitna for some people. But it's something that Allah did promise in the Quran for men, that they're going to have the hura'in and with women, that they're going to have their husbands and they're going to be sexually satisfied.
Right. Well, one of the messages I also took away from your book on that section was there are the verses in the Quran that say both believing men and women, if they're righteous, if they do good, Allah addresses both men and women, and that when they enter paradise, they'll both get to have whatever they want. Right? So of course there is that position of, even if a woman wants to have more than one husband in Jannah, well, let's just focus on all of us getting there, whether you're a man or a woman, and inshallah you'll be able to have your fulfillment the way you want. And some men might go, well, no, that's not the way it's supposed to be, but you can reverse the same argument of saying, well, in Jannah, Allah will remove any jealousy from the man if his wife has more than one husband, or she has, her own sexual partners that she wants to enjoy. So it almost goes the other way around, and I think there is that flexibility perhaps in examining some of these positions of the scholars and some of those verses in the Quran. Again, I'm not a scholar, but just some food for thought.
Barakallahu fik, I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, and lastly, this idea of attacking descriptions of paradise, I think, first of all, the descriptions of paradise are just gorgeous, and it's not just about the sex. Paradise, at least the way the Quran describes it, is talking about all of the things that we already love in this world, and how there you're going to get the ultimate version of it, right? So, for example, most human beings love food. They love to eat. They love to share food and try different foods. Paradise talks about all these different types of foods and the ways you're going to enjoy it. You're going to enjoy different types of drinks. So again, food here and cuisine is something that many people, it's an art, it's a science, it's something we all enjoy. But in Jannah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is your chef. You can have the best chef on earth here and you're going to fall out of your chair because the food was delicious. So imagine the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prepared specifically for His servants when it comes to food and drink and sexual partners and relations. And of course the idea of how everyone in paradise will be beautified. And Allah also talks about things like clothing and jewelry and real estate and homes and this and that. And again, it's all the same stuff that we pursue in this world. I mean, I know for a fact from what I know from women, many women dress up to look beautiful, sometimes because they want to get attention from men, but a lot of times, especially in some Muslim cultures, it's about showing off or showing the blessings that Allah gave them with other women. So, I mean, even this exists when it comes to what we wear and what kind of purse I have and the jewelry I have. So, of course, in paradise, it talks about how women are going to be wearing jewelry and wearing silk garbs, and they're going to be more gorgeous than the Hur al-Ain. So you have this appeal to both male and female psychology, if you will. And I find the descriptions of Jannah not to be skewed, but actually quite balanced and reflecting the human condition as we all honestly know it right here on earth.
I couldn't agree with you more, brother. MashaAllah. Just you describing it makes me just even want to go even more. SubhanAllah.
I mean, inshallah, may Allah forgive us and guide us and make us worthy of inheriting Allah's grace and forgiveness. But this has been a really, really interesting conversation. And again, it's high time that a book like yours comes out on the market. And I hope Muslims listening to this check it out. Brother Habeeb Akande, he has also published some other books, which you can find on his website. Brother Habeeb, it's been a pleasure to have you on today. And thanks again for all your valuable insight and work thus far.
Barakallahu feek. Thank you for inviting me. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Hopefully, inshallah, will be somewhat beneficial to the listeners.
Ameen ya Rabb. Karim Sirajuddin here. Thank you for tuning in. Please visit nurhuman.com to learn more about how I provide personal, spiritual, and relationship counsel. Please generously help sponsor this show to keep on going at patreon.com/coffeewithkareem. That's patreon.com/coffeewithkareem.